Davy gaat vragen stellen. Zij is gewoon de klos. Zij is gewoon de klos.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to Designing Cities for All, another episode. And it's part of our 2-year-long activity and research program,
where we take a deep dive into designing products, spaces, and systems for all. Just because you feel safe, or you feel welcome, or you feel included, doesn't mean that everyone else around you feels the same way.
We don't stand alone. We're not individuals that somehow planet or an island, you know?
And I think that's the beautiful thing of a diverse society, that everyone can add something from out of their own experience.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
I think if you can build relationships and use design as a tool to build those relationships, the better off we're all going to be.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned. Belonging is a very, very important concept.
You can try to take someone's place for a while, but you don't have the lived experience.
Let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity.
Be a person, not your role.
I think inclusion is not a choice.
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
In order to create truly inclusive public spaces that are accessible to everyone, we have to underline what everyone actually is.
Real inclusion, it's got nothing to do with the norm, but it's like something that we create from all different perspectives.
You know, so even when we bring everybody at the table, does everybody's voice count the same?
Because it's a big question of who tells these stories.
You know, the more I explore about other cultures, other religions, is the more ingredients I have to make the architecture and to answer the questions I get from society.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
Yes. Welcome to Designing Cities for All. We're in Pakhuis de Zwijger, and I'm so happy to see faces here live in the audience again. So thank you so much for showing up here. First of applause, because we missed you a lot. Okay, this is the first episode of a triptych of redesigning journalism, part of our 2-year research program, Designing Cities for All, in which we take a deep dive with designers into redesigning products, spaces, and systems for all. And we're not doing that just by ourselves. We've invited fellows to join us in this journey. And our first fellow of this year is OneWorld. We're really happy that they're joining us. My name is Dimfie Brown, by the way. And I also want to welcome people that are watching live online, maybe also joining later, or re-watching or listening to this episode later on. I want to introduce your guests to us, because I just mentioned OneWorld. They are sitting here as well. Seada Nourhussen, she's the chief editor of OneWorld, and John Olivieira at the end, publisher. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you've invited some guests.
Yes.
And we can introduce them maybe really shortly. But first, I want to hear from you what we're going to do today. Next to you, Seada, is Shivan Jagru. Welcome. Zaire Krieger is joining us as well. And online, we also have a guest, and that's Samantha Asamadu. I'm not sure if we see her already, but she will be joining us shortly as well. Okay, what we're going to do, we are having an hour program right now, live with people joining us online as well. You have the opportunity to ask us some questions. Just raise your hand, and I will invite you, because there's a mic over here, and you can ask a question. People online can do that too if you're joining live. We use Mentimeter for that, menti.com, and you can enter the code. And the code is 44387153. And I can see your questions on my screen, and then I can ask them as well. After the talk that we're going to have here, we have also a surprise for you, because we have some spoken word today. Jonathan Jinfo is reading some poetry for us at the end of this program. And after that, we still have the opportunity for everyone joining here live to have a conversation with each other. about the topic of today, and that's language. But first to OneWorld. Seada, John, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We sat here before, online though, everything online. And we were talking about the topic of the triptych you are organizing, which is redesigning journalism. You explained to us, you talked about OneWorld. Can you maybe shortly, for the people who didn't watch or don't know you yet, in just one sentence, what is OneWorld about?
I feel like I'm always the one saying this, so maybe
John can do that then.
You're doing this on purpose, so I'm giving the ball back to you.
Not really. Okay. So OneWorld is I guess everybody here knows what OneWorld is, right? Here in the audience. No? You just showed up? That's so interesting to me. Okay. So OneWorld is a magazine. So again, I'm the bad representative because I never bring a copy with me.
I have a copy.
Oh yeah, okay, cool. So OneWorld is a magazine that appears from this year on 4 times a year in deluxe print and daily online. And if I would describe us, I usually call it journalism for justice. We kind of center our topics around sustainability, identity, and human rights. We use the perspective of people that are marginalized. So that's the lens we use to look at the world and to look at issues. That's kind of our compass. Now you might say, oh, that's biased, but everybody's biased. We're just open about it. And so that's why we also say that we're not neutral.
Yeah, because that's something that we explored in our last episode.
Yeah, exactly. So neutrality, I think, doesn't exist. So you might as well be open about your, the compass you use or the perspective you use. And also we're the only Black-owned media title in this country.
And let me add to that. You can all subscribe on digital as well on the magazine. So please do, because you support journalism, and that's important in these times.
Yes.
In this triptych, we are exploring the design flaws in journalism and also explore solutions. Today, the episode of today is called The Power of Language. Can one of you explain why you wanted to have a full episode dedicated to language?
Well, I think this is something that, especially in Dutch journalism, is not tackled enough. We don't, I think we're not conscious enough about the type of language we use and the power it holds. And like I said, perspective is important, context is important, positionality is important. So as media, we have power.
So in that sense, you also see journalists or people behind news or media outlets as actually designers?
Yeah, as designers, because I think words that we decide to use are then copied by the media consumer, copied by people in the streets, copied by politicians, but vice versa as well. Even also the words that we copy from outside, we need to be we need to examine that and understand why we're using it. So often when we talk about language, which is something that is very central to what we do, so often so for instance, let me just give you an example. We decided to examine the way we write about climate change, which is something that Shiva will talk about. If you either use climate change or climate crisis, that's a huge difference. It kind of determines, what emphasis you use. Yeah. And how severe you think the situation is.
Yeah. I think that is a great example we can elaborate on.
Yeah,
later.
So we often also re-examine our own use of language, our own the way we sometimes we make a decision and we decide to not use a certain word or introduce a new term, and what we then do is we try to take the audience along with us to explain why we've made these decisions.
Yeah, make it transparent.
So it's not, often in this country, people are very allergic to, well, you can't say anything anymore, So that's a very common reaction to these types of decisions, but it's not like a ban or anything. It's like it's more about being very conscious and aware of why you use certain words and what it means for the discourse, you know? Just to have that conversation openly, I think we can do that tonight as well.
Yeah. John, what are you hoping to learn from the guests you've invited tonight?
Other perspectives. That's one of the reasons why we participated in this program. We were really interested from other perspectives, not only our own and the person who are aligned with us. So it's interesting to hear from a UK perspective, for instance, but also that we looking from a theme that is really close to our heart. So I love it that there's a scientist here. So I think that helps us, and I think that helps at least the public as well.
Yeah, and making it a transparent learning process.
True that.
Because you have a mission, but that's also a mission as in opening up a conversation that is transcending OneWorld.
Yeah, I think that the example that Seada was mentioning, that I believe that that's one of the roles of journalism, that at least it opens up your mind, making sure that there are conversations, new conversations, and probably gives you some new insight and new perspective. So that's one of the reasons why I am part of this.
Yeah. Let's invite your first speaker, who's actually joining on Zoom. Writer, journalist, and founder of Media Diversified. Before we're going to introduce her, maybe I want to... Hi, Amanda, you're already joining us.
Samantha.
Samantha Asamadu.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hey.
Maybe you can tell us why you've invited Samantha.
Yeah, because I was actually following Media Diversified years ago when I was still a journalist for a Dutch newspaper. And I thought it was very interesting that there was this title. It's interesting because she was already doing what I'm doing now. That there was a media title that was actually built around the perspective of people of color in the UK, if I might, kind of summarize it like that, and also aimed at creating a new, league of journalists who aren't. Like myself, maybe raised in the classical or traditional way. Within media. And having them to explore, letting them explore their craft on their own and on their own terms. And I thought that was very interesting. And I invited Samantha because I suddenly realized that I didn't see much of Media Diversified anymore, and so I thought, there might be in a bit of a, it might be not easy to keep the model going. But I think they're making a comeback. So
yeah, well, maybe Samantha can share something about that. Because hi, Samantha.
Hi there. Good to see you all. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Was there anything that you wanted to add to the introduction that Seada already gave?
No, Seada was completely right. We did close actually in 2019, and we came back in December 2021. So just coming up to 3 months.
So recently, yeah.
Yeah, very recently. So you've probably seen a lot of noise from us and a lot of activity. So that's probably. Well, yeah, exactly. You didn't see us for a while, but yeah, it's a hard model. But perhaps we'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, it's a hard path to follow when you are trying to beat your own path and not be part of the mainstream media, MSM, whatever you want to call it. And that's that comes from different areas. There's the people that are pushing against you. There's the money issue. There's lots of things that you have to battle over to have your own independent media organization.
Let's go back to the start, because what inspired you to found Media Diversified?
Okay, yeah, it goes back to 2013. So I was briefly a foreign correspondent in Uganda, East Africa, and I reported from Uganda and Congo. And I also, at the same time, a documentary filmmaker. So I made my first documentary film called The Super Ladies for Al Jazeera in 2009, and then went on to try and get funding for my second film. And so after having covered bombs and landslides and all sorts of things in Uganda, I came back to London thinking I'd get funding for my second film, which I failed miserably to do. And so to cut a long story short, I thought, if nobody's funding us, we have to create our own organisation, our own apparatus to be able to, you know, people like my nephews, young people, to give them the opportunities that we were denied.
And who is we? Are there more people you?
Well, yeah, I started off by myself, but then a team over time came on board. So at the moment we have Yasmin Gunratram, who's been with me since 2013. She's our academic curator. So she's also a professor, but she has a space on the website. I mean, it's all the same website, but she commissions up to 2,000 word articles from an academic discipline, but more creative, you know, more accessible. And, you know, a lot of her articles that she's commissioned have gone viral. You know, there's so many titles. Black People Don't Go to Galleries, The Reproduction of Taste and Cultural Value was one of our first viral articles, and the Museum Association republished it, and so on. And there's and so also there's Marcus Daniel, who is the editor-in-chief. Now, I was the editor-in-chief, but I employed him from December 2018. We closed, we come back, and he's back again. We've also got Kavita Bano, who's the editor, creator of something called Literature Must Fall, which she did on her own, and after she'd written for us for years, she wrote a seminal piece called Decolonize, Not Diversify in 2015, which got a lot of attention, and on the back of that, a literary festival was started, and she started her own organisation. But now she's come on board with us. And she'll be looking at literature, you know, demystifying and literature, basically. So often we put things on a pedestal and we don't critique ourselves, and that is what her space is for. She's not interested in the white media or the white gaze. It's about what we do and critiquing ourselves and making ourselves better. And then also we've got Manveer, who's our editorial assistant, who's just come on board a couple of weeks ago because we crowdfunded on Twitter and just got enough money to pay him for a while. And also a lovely girl called Florence Quinn, who's come on as a intern type thing, as she wants to be a filmmaker.
Awesome. So you have a complete new team. You're doing a restart. What do you want to add to the field of journalism with this new team? What is the new mission statement or the improved mission statement?
Okay, well, I'll just go back very quickly. 2015 is when I decided I don't care about diversifying the media. We grow our own thing. And so since then, that's always been the rationale. We're not interested in just slotting. I'd love to see more people get into the mainstream media, but it's not my goal. So our goal is to, what's coming up is I'm going to be building an equitable newsroom. And what that means is equitable, we all get paid the same. And we have a news director, a CEO, copywriters, all of that sort of thing. So I'm just going into funding rounds in the next few months. And then we're also changing a little bit. So we've always been people of colour, but what I've noticed after doing some work on something called indeterminate sentences for public protection, and that's where a lot of the Labour government brought in this rule in 2005, I think, where they basically criminalised young people, 17-year-olds, for stealing mobile phones, stuff like that, and gave them an indeterminate sentence, which meant that they had a tariff, which is 2.5 years usually, and then they end up for various reasons staying in there longer. So you find people have been in for 17 years. Whoa. Having stolen a mobile phone. I wrote about it as a journalist for Open Democracy, but it's, you know, it got all over the place because we very much promoted it, and I had a great editor called Ramsey at Open Democracy. But anyway, through that, I've noticed that nobody really cares or campaigns for people in the working class who are white.
Yeah.
Strangely. Obviously, black and brown people, they're very much marginalised and oppressed as working class people. However, you know, we have a lot of solidarity. We will fight for these people, where somehow white working class people, or people from the working class who are white, don't, sorry, that's my language thing, I'll maybe
no, that's
later. But they often get forgotten and there's no voice. So we will be publishing people who are white from working classes. You know, we already do Roma and...
Great, so when you're talking about diversifying the newsroom, then there are multiple communities that you are actually involving, and you're actually expanding those communities that you are addressing.
Yeah,
that's
for a
great.
Necessary reason, yeah.
That's actually a topic that we also discussed previously, and we are going to talk about this more in the third episode that we're going to organize as well. So this is such interesting feedback to take into that conversation as well.
Can I ask something?
One short question. Yes.
In the end, you're writing about justice. To be honest,
the essence.
Yeah. So I mean, in that perspective, there's a lot of similarities.
Yes. That's why she was invited.
That's why she was invited, right? Okay. I would love to join you later, to ask you to join our conversation later when we also introduced, after we also introduced our other speakers, because I would love to give the word to Shivun Jagru, University Lecturer of Sustainability, Climate and Justice at the University of Leiden. What is a scientist in sustainability doing here talking about language?
Well, first of all, I use language on an everyday basis.
Yeah.
And in my teaching and in my research, language is a key medium that kind of shapes how I think, because language kind of structures also the way we think. And also it provides perspectives for people, my students, but also researchers. So the language is very much in the field of sustainability. I feel it's very much considered as a neutral medium. Mm-hmm. So it's about, climate is changing. We need to tackle it with adequate resources, instruments. We need to intervene in a kind of efficient way, as efficient as possible. So that kind of circumvents or avoids the basic idea that language is already steering and framing the way we define nature as an external.
Yeah. Can you name examples of that? Seada already mentioned something about using the word climate crisis to put emphasis on urgency on some things, but I can imagine there are more of those examples.
Yeah, exactly. So climate crisis indeed points to kind of a systemic root cause that lies at the nature of the
so not
of the
climate
problem.
Change anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting that the Guardian, the UK newspaper, I think 2 years ago they actually mentioned that they will not use climate change anymore, but climate crisis.
This happened in 2019.
Yeah, exactly. So that also means they take responsibility for, or they are aware that language actually shapes the way we imagine the problem, and they don't want to have this kind of moral high ground that they are neutral in any way, shape, or form. So they want to use language in a more kind of open way. I think also similar to OneWorld is trying to do. And something that I really came across when I started working in the field of sustainability was sustainability and the triple P, right? So you have people, profit, planet, and that kind of assumes that there's a kind of a happy clappy win-win situation. You can just make as long as you make sure all the P's are in there. But the fourth P is always absent, which is the P from power. Right, and if you include power in that kind of way of thinking, you can start thinking more critically about conflicts between planet and profit, for example, and you start opening up the box of how sustainability is basically avoiding issues of power and avoiding issues of exclusion. So in my conversation,
and that's actually what we need to discuss when we're talking about injustices.
Exactly. So you very often have these, these nice charging poles for electric vehicles, and you see, and it's being celebrated by policymakers, by journalists. They make pictures of it, and it's also considered as part of the energy transition. But if you scratch the surface a little bit, and what's not being captured on the photographs and by journalists is that's what's happening in the supply chain further down the road. So you need, in order for the electric vehicles, you need minerals in conflict zones in Congo, for example. And that's something that's underreported, even though it's part and parcel of the celebration that journalists are also participating in, together with politicians and tech companies and electric vehicle suppliers. So I would say a good journalist would also scratch that surface and kind of dig deeper and don't take it at face value. And my experience in the Netherlands, a lot of journalists and not you, but
I went to the Congo. I don't know.
A lot of journalists, they just take press releases at face value, and they'll just copy paste, and they don't really dig deeper. And that is also because they don't use a critical lens, because language for them is very often a relatively neutral term. But I follow the philosopher Jacques Derrida here. He actually says something like, language is one of the first domains of violence, because it very much normalizes hierarchy without you actually knowing that it's doing this, right? So it also excludes worlds or experiences if you just use one word like an electric car or sustainability.
But I think, don't you think that it's not just the supply chain, which is, I think, if you're like an average journalist, you might have heard about, the conflict minerals that are behind it. I think that's not really underreported on. So if you're kind of closing your eyes for that, that's kind of on purpose, I think. But I think it's also where that electric pole is positioned and in which areas or in which neighborhoods and for which people. So there's also that side, not just the supply chain, but the consumer chain.
Definitely.
So it's seen as this thing of progress, but for who?
Yes.
It's seen as a solution.
Yes.
And that's how it's been positioned. And that's in my perspective, that's all to do with power.
Yeah, true that. That's definitely part of the problem. There's so many angles, like sub-problems to the broader problem. But this definitely is one of them. And very often it's celebrated because the people that drive electric vehicles have solar panels. They are considered front runners, right? So they are in front of they're running in front of the transition, basically. And we are the laggers. We are trying to keep up with them, right? But in doing that, you accept that they are in front, right, and they are having moral high ground, and you kind of avoid that they have the resources, the finances, the knowledge, the network, and thereby you kind of avoid that there is power differential. So in my reframing of these front runners, I try to label them as the eco elite, the green elite. Yes, they are front runners, but at the same time they have certain kind of green privileges that they actually are not aware of. So we need new language to kind of label that and be more and be sensible to those power differentials.
Before we go deeper into this conversation, I would also like to introduce our third guest, because I see you nodding a lot.
Yeah,
and
I'm agreeing.
You are like all about language. Zaire Krieger, spoken word artist, activist. You talk a lot about human rights, and injustice is a topic that is addressed in your art a lot. First of all, I mean, I can imagine asking a spoken word artist what the answer would be, but why the love for language?
Ooh. So my mom's a teacher, and my dad is a filmmaker. So I think I grew up with the understanding that visuals and language matter, and that they shape our knowledge and they shape our mind in how we look at anything. So I grew up, and then I went to study law. And law deals with language in a totally different way. It deals with creating the parameters for our behavior, how we should behave, how society wants us to behave, and what the sort of limits are to our behavior, and then the consequences to our behavior. And then I started doing journalism. I actually freelanced quite some for OneWorld. And then I had Seada in my email telling me how much language was going to shape how people were going to read my pieces. And then I started doing spoken word, and then all of a sudden I was dealing with language in a creative manner. So I was dealing with creating my own words to things that I wanted to describe but didn't know how to. And then I was asked to translate this incredible poet, Amanda Gorman, who
congratulations.
Thank you. Which is a whole discussion on positionality on itself. But when I was translating this, I was very much confronted with the choices. So all of my life, the way that I learned how to deal with language prepared me for this, because I realized if I did not have that training, I wouldn't know how to translate something to Dutch, like the word, for example, white. When you translate a word like white to Dutch, you have various options. You actually don't, but we act like you do. And you can say blank, which means like blanco, like clean, and you can say white, what actually the word is.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of confrontations that I had with how I look at language and how we translate from language to another language and what that means for power. Another choice that we made.
Yeah, because you can't translate everything literally.
You can't translate everything properly, which frustrates me to no end because I want it to be exactly what it feels like in English. But one choice that we made is we capitalized the word black in Dutch as well as she does in the English version. That is a choice that was also heavily criticized, but there is a reason for that because we're trying to translate a power structure and the concept of blackness that is socialized and not necessarily a true reality. So there were choices that were made that have to do with where does in what context are we saying these words, and what do they mean in day-to-day life. Another good example, which is a little bit more fun, less heavy, is the word shade. She uses the word shade in the English version. If you know the English language and sort of pop culture etymology, you would know that the word shade in black culture means to shade someone, to criticize someone. You can translate that properly, but it's important to have that.
It's a mood.
Right, it's a mood, it's a feeling. You can't translate that properly, but you have to know the context and where that comes from to be able to translate that. So language is not just language, it is so much more behind and underneath and around it. That makes it important to know, to translate properly.
Seada, John, now we've introduced everyone. Before you can ask questions to your speakers, because I bet you want to know stuff they have probably the answers to. I also want to give you the opportunity to ask questions if you like. You can save the question for later on. In a group's discussion, but you can also just raise your hand and then I can invite you to the stage. And for everyone watching at home, you can pop your questions in the Zoom, in the Mentimeter, menti.com, and the code was let's see on the image.
Where's the code?
44387153.
You memorized it?
No, it's behind you. I wish I did. Anyway, three people all working with language on a daily basis. You just said you wanted to make the conversation about why language. As journalists, we can have the responsibility to reconstruct the language and the way people view the world. How can we make that discussion publicly? How can we learn collectively? You do that in a certain way?
Yeah, so like I said, we don't, normally like in every newspaper, let's say newspapers, they have a section about language or about the words they use, but I feel like in Dutch, it's usually about, are we going to say pannenkoek or pannenkoek? You know, that's like as far as it goes, or mierenneuk or mierenneuk. You know, that's kind of, I can't translate that, sorry. That's really, sorry, sometimes translate. It's like ants and it's very graphic. But anyway, so that's the Dutch language.
No, but it's more like shape, but it's like not context.
Exactly. So what I'm missing in this country is that it's not about grammar and about, but it's about what do these words, who do these words represent and who they don't represent.
And who do they serve?
Who do they serve? Who are they amplifying? Who are they silencing? So all of this, and like I said, when you ask how can we make this a more an engaged thing, where the public is engaged with these things, it's first of all, language is a lot of fun. It's very, very fun. It's a cool thing to think about. Yeah. And I think it's when you say you work with language, we all work with language all
on a daily
day
basis.
long. It's not like it's for a certain segment of society. So. But to then think about why are you, I think it's like, so one of the things we did, we when I started out, this was kind of a notorious article, is that I said, we're going to stop using these colonial words. This was back in 2018.
Can you give an example of
And it was a bomb hit.
Yeah, so I was actually talking about, well, I get kind of sick of myself telling this story but it's interesting because the reaction to it was so severe. Like, I didn't really realize things were going to be this heated. But so for an example, so if you know the history of OneWorld, is that it started out as a magazine for the development aid sector. So this was way before I came. And so a lot of the stories were still kind of about kind of saviorism and kind of, and a lot of the proposals we got from freelance journalists were really around, I have an uncle in the, in, I don't know, Indonesia or whatever, and he's doing such great things for the locals. And, that's also a word, the locals. And can't you do like a portrait of him or something? So this was the thing I tried to get out of.
Yeah, avoid.
So it was important to kind of make a statement, but it was a statement to ourselves and looking at the headlines and the words that we used to use and how we were going to kind of end that and introduce alternatives. So you're asking for
I think that is also a good one, that you're offering alternatives.
Yeah,
not just like saying
you
can't
have
do
to
that.
speak,
Exactly.
you have to say something. So it's not like you can't have an alternative, you have to talk about it. So so you're asking me for an example, but it's been so long that I don't know anymore.
Stammen.
Oh yeah,
I know because I actually have it open while I translate.
And this is so interesting. So there's still people coming over saying, yeah, I have it next to me when I'm writing a text or I'm...
So in English, tribes,
right. Yeah, which has a very different connotation. I guess Samantha can in English. So stammen in Dutch is really has a very different weight to it, I feel, than tribes in English.
There's a different history involved.
Yeah, the same goes for indigenous in English and inheems in Dutch. Inheems really has this 19th century feel to it in Dutch. It doesn't in English. And actually, what was interesting is that I put indigenous, so the Dutch inheems, in that list as well. Like, we're going to use oorspronkelijke volken, so like, I don't know how you translate that well. That's like, it's kind of...
First peoples. Different that we talk
First
about.
Peoples, yeah, like First Nations or First
Nations,
Peoples, yeah.
Yeah.
It's good that you're here, Shiva. Then a Surinamese woman emailed me and she said, wait. The word inheems, you can't just scratch that because this is a word that the only Dutch-speaking country in South America, because it was colonized by the Dutch, has fought for to keep, so that because it's connected to like international law and
so you would be erasing people if you would cancel the word. Yeah.
So then I was like, okay, apparently I'm misinformed or I'm ill-informed. So why don't you write a piece on OneWorld to correct us?
Yeah.
So that's how you asked, how do you engage? How do you make it?
And in this case, it's also context depending.
Right.
Yeah.
In another context, you wouldn't use the word.
Exactly, but by inviting criticism in and by not thinking that you're always right or not being afraid of it being a learning process for yourself as well, which I think is, when we're talking about design flaws, is often a design flaw within media, that we have this idea that we are here to inform everybody else, but sometimes we need to be informed as well.
Yeah.
Amen.
Samantha, I see you nodding.
Oh yeah,
I was wondering how that
I
is
think it's so
working in the UK.
Yeah, it's so important to engage with people who read your work. I mean, what's the point otherwise? Listening to your audience. So
because you also mentioned criticizing yourself as well.
Yeah. Well, we've got a lot of criticism over the years from outside and inside. But I think so a lot of our writers are people who just used to follow us on Twitter. And, they were just saying interesting stuff or critical stuff. And, I or one of the editors approached them and asked them, let's expand on this. It's not all about the tweets, yeah? let's get more than 240 characters. So yeah, engaging with the people. And that is something that the actual mainstream media very rarely do. The Guardian maybe a little bit back in the day, I don't know about now. They used to, find people who'd written comments on their articles and ask them, will you write for us? But I'm not sure if they do that now. But yeah, I agree.
You also wanted to mention an article as an example how you brought change in how to view different topics. Can you share that one?
All right. Well, there's a couple of articles. I'm not sure. Well, the one I've got open on my phone at least is called Ethnic Minority No.
Yeah, the IPP.
Global Majority. The IPP one. Oh, okay. Sorry, what was the question?
No, what you were just saying is that this article was an example of how you actually changed perspectives on a certain topic. How did you do that with that article?
Okay, I hope I did. I mean, that's just part one. I've got part 2 and 3 coming out quite soon. The point was that, I mean, it was class and exclusive is because nobody knew that it was going on. And that's because you can say working class, but there's an underclass in this country, in the UK, where people just don't know that was happening. There's thousands of prisoners who were put in prison and they're, 10 years, 16 years, and then even if they get out, they're on something called license, which means they if anything happens outside of prison, if your neighbour calls on you because they don't, calls the police on you because they don't like you, you get put back in prison. So what I did is bring light to it, and I don't think that's the end goal at all. So I've been working, before I did the article, how I came across it is a campaigner came up to me on Twitter. She saw some work I was doing on the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is a horrific bill that Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, is trying to push through Parliament and the House of Lords at the moment. So she just saw that I was somebody who was active doing stuff. And so I went and met her in Wales. I live in London, but I met her in Cardiff. And she told me about this thing, which I'd never heard of. And the majority of people in this country have never heard of it.
What was it?
The indeterminate sentences for public protection. Right. So those sentences used to be used for, they were never used at all. They used to be life sentences for people, terrorism, rape, sexual abuse, the worst cases of manslaughter. That's where life sentences were used for. What they did is they brought in a sentence which expanded to 153 different crimes, supposedly, and basically wiped out a generation of black, brown, and white working class men and women. So there's 4 women who's died in prison whilst those sentences were going on. So what I've done is wrote and given light to a man called Leroy. He was 17, I think. Or no, he was quite young when he was put in prison. He'd stolen a mobile phone in public, but with no violence, and he's in there 17 years later. I also talked about Mohammed, a Muslim man. He's the uncle of somebody who got in contact with me, who was beaten up outside of his home, but he fought back, and they put him in prison, and he's been in there 16 years. And some other people, Charlotte Noakes, who was, she died in prison after they given her wrong medication. So I have brought light to those stories, but I haven't finished, because what comes next is what's most interesting, and that's, hopefully we get these people out of prison, Yeah. So, yeah.
And as Seada just mentioned, some examples how language plays a role to put different lights on these situations.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you explain how using different words or alternatives, offering alternatives, can help you
elucidate on these things,
stories, or at least get the message across that you actually want to.
Yeah, well, around 2013, I asked 10 writers to contribute to 2 articles, part 1 and part 2 of articles called Ethnic Minority No, global majority, because you have things like people who call white people who go to another country expats, but yet if a black person comes to a Western country, whatever you want to call it, so actually I should be a bit more precise considering we're talking about language. But anyway, they would be called an immigrant, and both terms are loaded, but they're loaded in different ways. And so I asked these writers to do something. So what we did is basically we asked 10 writers for their opinions on the classifications of terminology used to describe people, and we stressed that there was no right or wrong answer. And so and these were people, some of them had written for us before, or some of them I just reached out to. I think they'd have an interesting perspective. I mean, the first one goes, there are a great deal of acronyms and labels used by societies to address and refer to people who are not white. There are reasons to be hesitant to use all and any of these labels in particular instances. So ethnic minority is a term usually used to mean not white, but there are also white ethnicities that it's applied to, such as traveller communities. This betrays the willful ignorance of the media or other users in applying inaccurate blanket terms. So the updated version, minority ethnic, is also problematic. As a homogenous group, minority ethnics are not a minority at all. They are the largest demographic in the world in terms of population. And that goes on. That's by a writer called Jude Wanger. And then, I mean, it's very worth reading, even though that is now 9 years old, that article. It's still as prescient today. And then I did an update about 3 years later and got another 10 writers. And I'm going to do one soon again, just to see where we are with it.
Well, what I'm interested in is, what is the alternative?
Well, so I started, so you may have known, Media Diversified is the company, but if you look on our social media, it says writers of colour. Yeah. And the reason why I chose that was in, at the time, I watched a video by a group in America called Sisters of Song, and they are an activist group, and they had, they were doing some activism, and people weren't happy with just being called, black or Asian or whatever. There was no homogeneity amongst it, and so they decided amongst themselves to call themselves women of colour, for a building of solidarity, and not to soften or destroy differences, because that's important to me. And I mean, it's something maybe I'll look into later in the years, because we've had people who've written for us who have gone against the term people of colour. I've literally got, because there's something in our country called politically black, and it caused a big maelstrom in the academia world about 5 years ago when there was some. So what happens here? We have professors and so on, and they call themselves politically black, or they call of colour. And what you find is that you'll get a lot of people saying that, and then you get 0.1% of black women or 1% of black men are actually professors. But that stat is hidden because of the terminology that people use. Do you understand me?
I see you all nodding. Who wants to respond to this? Seada?
I mean, so yeah, I think it's really, really tricky to try and catch a very multi-layered experience of different. I cannot say ethnic minorities because that's not what they are, and that's kind of insane. And so I'm going to completely reroute this question. What does when you call someone an ethnic minority, what does that do to them? That's what I want to focus on. Like, what does that do to this group? How does that paint them? Because they're indeed completely not a minority, but because you named them a minority, they become othered. And that I find insane.
I think maybe it started out as a way of protecting people by calling them a minority, like as in a group that's not really recognized or visible, or so it could have.
So it was good intentions.
I don't talk about good intentions, but so anyway, but it, that could be the case. I'm not sure. I wasn't around when that was invented.
But it's also a legal term, right?
Yeah. So how would you legally?
I don't, because of color I also find tricky indeed, because indeed it like completely undersneeuwt. It completely
it kind of
covers.
It makes white not a color, right?
Yes, that's why of color is indeed very tricky, because white is a color.
I think what we come back to is that with terms like these, because even this or last week, our National Statistics Bureau, CBS, came up with yet another term for people that aren't white, or people that aren't originally white, or I don't even know how to name it anymore. But so they've come up with this brilliant thing called migrant. So it was like they used to say Western, non-Western, and now they've come up with migrant and children of migrants, because the criticism was, when will somebody become Dutch, right? Because it's like generations and generations back, you're being told first, second, third, fourth generation Moroccan or whatever. So, but what's interesting to me is that from their perspective, and it was coming back to how that word came about, or that decision, it's interesting that they mostly consulted white institutions and the police for some reason.
Why?
Talking about legally, that's very interesting for me to consult the police about how to call people that they target. But and also, what's interesting to me is that the word Dutch is never ever an alternative when coming up with these new terms, because this is a thing that's happening every couple of years, because then, you know, it doesn't, there's criticism again and it doesn't work and whatever. But when it comes to the alternatives that, let me just, I'd say marginalized people, I don't say minorities, but of marginalized people, because that's contextual, right? Within this context.
Maybe not the perfect word, but it's still like better than all the other things.
Because I don't want to call myself a minority, you know. It doesn't feel right, but also it's not true in the world, you know.
And it's interesting because what it does, all these kind of words.
Just to finish my thought. So we are trying to come up with new terms, but I feel the difficulty we have is not centering whiteness. So of color, the issue I have with of color is that it centers whiteness as the norm, and we are the ones of color. That's how it feels to me, but I don't know if it's accurate or.
But I think there's an underlying issue that it's not only the words that matter; it's also the concept underneath. So if you change the word from allochtoon, autochtoon to people with a migratieachtergrond, it's the same discourse.
Exactly.
If the words change and the concepts don't, you still have the same power differential. So what we need to do is not only think about the changing words, but also the discourse itself and the way we structure. Whose knowledge matters, whose experience matters, whose do we erase, whose experiences are excluded, and this is, I think, where the creativity of language is, I think, useful. So the example of environmental racism in the U.S. as a concept, yes, it was an innovation in language, but it also expresses the intersection between civil rights movements and climate activists or environmental activists. So at that intersection foregrounded experiences of communities that were not acknowledged before. And it has real impact. It can have real impact in policies and institutional responses.
It's not only on basis, but like long-term effects.
Yes, and this, like last example I want to mention is the example of we have the concept of genocide. We know what it is: the structural destruction. Or massacre of people. But we don't have the legal category yet of ecocide. Ecocide is the structural massacre of ecosystems, nature. And there's a whole struggle behind making that into a legal category, because what happens if you do it, if you do have that legal category, you can hold countries and companies accountable and let them pay for it and drag them to court. And if you don't have that, you don't have the recognition, you don't have the legal authority and a response you can have.
What is needed for a transition like that?
All of the above. I would say, struggle at all levels. So if you're an activist, you can struggle in your own ways or use artistic means. If you're a scholar or a researcher, you can use other means. If you're a writer, journalist, you can use different means, because all of us participate in the discourse.
All can have responsibility, take responsibility.
Because we all participate in discourse. We all create it.
But I think it starts with awareness, right? If you're not aware of those power structures, then why would you look for words? You know, I think what kind of sets all of us on this panel apart, maybe from mainstream media makers in this country, or mainstream or the average scientist or the average writer or the average marketing person or business person, it's
compliment.
that we actually look for those words because the existing language is not capturing our reality. So unless you feel what that inequality or that power imbalance is doing to how you look at the world. I think Samantha wants to say something, but I think talking about...
And I also have something else.
Yeah, but I think talking, because we're almost in an hour, and so I'm just going to take over. But when talking about, about this reality, I brought a clip.
Well, maybe we can ask Samantha first to respond, because I wanted to show that one.
Okay, sure.
But Samantha wanted to respond to something that Siobhan said.
So I think what it is what we're really talking about is power. I think the whole program has been about justice and power. And so just quickly, I mean, it's great to talk, but also, we have to think, what can we do? And so something that we did in the UK is we set up something called the Trashies. And so the Trashies is the equivalent of the Hollywood the Razzies. You've heard of them. And so what happens over a 2-week period, we ask all of Twitter and Instagram to nominate an article that perpetrates either, xenophobia, racism, transphobia, and, use the hashtag, the Trashies, screenshot the article from the last calendar 12 months before we open the nominations, and then just put it on Twitter and nominate these articles, and they can, tag in the journalist who wrote it or not, whatever. And then after 2 weeks, we collate all the nominations, we put them in a poll, and then for another 2 weeks, they can vote. And then we also, at the same time, they can vote for the worst article that was happened in the last 12 months. They can also vote for the worst publication in the last 12 months. And now what that is, I mean, it can come across as farcical, but it is not. It is very important, because what we're doing is giving the people a voice back. All those people that these journalists call below the line, who they kind of look down on and don't really talk to. There's very few above the line journalists, mainstream journalists, who actually talk to the people who they serve. We are servants as journalists.
Fantastic idea.
This is the time. They have the power to say this is not right. This is what. And people take notice.
So really make it a public discussion.
So do it. Start it. Do it with us.
I already know 5 people I would give that journalism Razzie.
Well, let's have a Dutch version then.
That'd be a daily task, I feel.
You brought a clip, and it's a pretty recent clip. Talking about use of words, but also what it does with the visuals that you have in your mind when using certain kinds of words.
I think it needs a trigger warning, because to me it was so. Of course, what's happening in Ukraine right now is awful, and the violence and the aggression and everything, but. For me, watching from here, what was also awful was the coverage of it and the words used by Western journalists or correspondents, and how the word war was.
I had to check if I was really looking at the news.
Yeah, me too, actually. Me too. I hope it's not fake news. If it is, then this is a disclaimer, but I don't think it is. But it was also, I think for me, I already felt it. I already felt the double standards, the even just the all of a sudden the friendliness towards refugees and the willingness of the people to go outside and which is good, which I applaud, but it's very selective. We don't see this happening for refugees that don't look like Europeans. We don't see this happening. We don't see this opening up borders and changing policies, and all of a sudden, so all these things were available to us before, and this was an option. So now it's an option when, there were people in distress and people fleeing very urgent crises way before this. And this is not that I don't think the Ukrainian people deserve this type of treatment. I think all people deserve this type of treatment. And so above that, there was the disbelief. The first thing I saw was that even before this was a demonstration I think in Berlin or in a German city, where a woman was crying. She had the Ukrainian flag on her face, and she was saying, And standing here, we're demonstrating because war in Europe is unacceptable.
Yikes.
Yeah.
And there were all these headlines or slogan or like quotes from people saying Putin brought war to Europe.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Since the World War II, and I was like, wasn't there an entire Balkan War going on not so long ago? So this European exceptionalism was so heavy on everything that was coming out from the support to the reporting to the way politicians talked about it, and it was to me violent in itself. On top of the actual violence going on. So this clip is like a accumulation by, I think, Al Jazeera. About
there was actually different news reporters, different newsrooms covering the recent
it's not
happenings.
good.
Yeah. Let's take a look.
Eamon, before I go, some of the media coverage of the conflict in Ukraine has been kind of off. We have reporters and pundits making some rather awful remarks about the nature of this conflict and these refugees versus, say, conflicts and refugees in the Middle East. Have a listen.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, you know, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. You know, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too.
I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
Eamon, first off, Europe has been home to some of the worst wars and worst war crimes in human history. I mean, the Holocaust. So why this surprise that bad things are happening in Europe? And second, when they say, oh, civilized cities, and in another clip, well-dressed people, and this is not the third world, they really mean white people, don't they? The reason they seem to want us to care more about Ukraine, and we should care about Ukraine, but not because they're white Europeans. That shouldn't be the reason we care about Ukraine.
Yeah, no, that's what's so disturbing in all of this. And in fact, not only that, it's trying to make an excuse why the West should get involved and embrace these refugees and help them. Listen, let's be clear. You should encourage and actually help refugees because they are fleeing a war. I don't know if you saw this. There was a op-ed today in the Telegraph. I think we have it. We'll put it up for our viewers to see. This was an op-ed in which the writer, Daniel Hannon, said that these people, the Ukrainians, they're like us. They watch Netflix. They have Instagram accounts. They read uncensored newspaper, and then goes on to say that war is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote population. Oh, no, it's happening to us here in Europe. And to your point, you're absolutely correct. Europe has had some of the worst human rights abuses and atrocities and wars in not just modern history, in all of history. Good to see you, Mahdi. Greatly appreciate it, my friend.
Yeah, painful. Yeah. We had to laugh because it was only, I mean, couldn't even believe it when I heard one of them.
Truly, mask off.
Yeah, it's very painful. I mean, I guess it's at the same time I thought it was refreshing because people were coming taking their masks off, and that was So I think it's good to. So when you think about language, so a thing like war is apparently to a lot of people in newsrooms not meant for white people. Yep. Maybe to engage in, like to send troops to other countries, you know, but it's not supposed to happen on our turf. When I mean ours, like white people.
Is that one of the reasons? Because we actually have a question from one of the people joining us online. Why does it take newsrooms so long to adopt new language? And even a recent example, this person is mentioning Dutch newsrooms keep using the Russian spelling of Kiev.
Yeah. Okay, so this is okay. The Russian spelling of Kiev is like, I think, is a discussion we've been having for like 2 days. So we can't compare that to other things, I think. So I think that's
redesigning takes a little bit longer.
Yeah, that takes a bit more time. So I think that's a recent thing. Also, that would mean that you take a stance in a political discussion, right? So that's, I think, also. I mean, it's the same as I know years ago we stopped calling Burma, and said Myanmar at some point, and then changed it up back again. I don't know why, but so it had to do with regime change. So these are more like, okay, where do we stand politically, or which regime do we support or find, acceptable? Or
but it has to do with the position that you are neutral, yes or no. I mean, that's still that's a discourse.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting how in these positions, when it comes to regimes that are far away and that we can have a certain stance on that doesn't influence anything, it's much easier. But, Kiev is close, so how are you going to...
Am I on mic?
So
yes,
can I just...
You can join.
Okay, you want to inject first?
Just to say, the word regime is very loaded as well. And that's why I call it the British regime. Quite often...
Exactly. Regime is a word that's for non-Western
Yeah, in the Netherlands we call it overheid, which is even less political. The word state we never use, only if it's illegal.
So the question was about why does it take journalists so long, newsrooms so long? The reason I think personally is because they expect, and this was told to me as they were doing the covering for this book and copy-pasting each other, which is wild if you actually research how many times newsrooms completely copy-paste each other and don't question anything. The reason is because they expect you as readers to get it, and they want to cater to you. Obviously, a large part of it is also, casual racism, but they think that readers have a certain comprehension level, and they are lazy. So I really think that the whole idea of the Razzies is really, really smart because it calls upon the readers to hold the newsrooms accountable and say, hey, you need to not insult our intelligence and use these words.
To speed up the process.
But at the same time, it also kind of relieves journalists themselves from doing the examining of their language. So because what we do a lot of these articles where we ask our colleagues, so how come the N-word is still in your, still appears in your newspaper, and is there a policy around it? And they find that very annoying because there's no policy ever. They kind of wing it, and it's just whoever wants to use it, they can use it, or who doesn't, don't. But there's not like a stance on it. So I think why it takes them so long is because a lot of media want to remain want to keep this idea of being neutral and not taking a stand. So by making these decisions, they're afraid that their neutrality will be lifted, and they will have to make a choice even further on other topics. So I think it's, especially for Dutch media, very unusual to make statements when, for instance, in British media, especially American media, it's quite normal even to give out advice, we endorse this candidate for elections, for instance, or we, I think that's a bit much, but at least what you're dealing with, and I think Dutch media is very afraid of saying, we think this is wrong, or we think this is right.
Do you think it also has to do with the business models underlying the media, mass media? Because it's, in a way, of course, we all know that language does not represent reality, but it creates it. I think journalists are well aware of it, and they create certain publics, certain audiences by using certain words, and they cater to them. So how much do you think it's also related to the kind of we just need, this is our business model. If we use language in a different way, and if we are actually honest and nuanced and critical about it, it kind of
alienates our readers.
Yes, and
that's exactly the reason. But it's not entirely true. There is one of the biggest papers is really clear in this position. It's the Telegraph. So I mean, that takes the position, use the language.
They're not clear about anything.
Well, in this case, they are.
Yeah, but if they are more nuanced, or if they are more
stance, right?
reflexive,
it's not like they're saying we're using these words on purpose. They're just like, what a lot of media tell us. They're like, we just do whatever the people are doing.
Yeah.
So it's not for us. It's the same as
so to change this is really needed.
Yeah.
They're reactive.
They're reactive. They don't take the initiative because by taking the initiative, they're afraid that they might be seen as has been literally said to us, and this wasn't even around a topic that's that sensitive, I think, around climate. We are not activists. This was actually the newspaper I used to work for. You know, we're not activists. We can't be doing that. Yeah. Pacifist, yeah.
It's impossible to be neutral, though. This is what's sad, is because everybody does have a point of view, whether they think they have or not, and that is fed through their copy, whatever that happens to be. And I think the best journalists for me are the ones that admit that they have a point of view, because we all do.
I think for now that is a great conclusion to take into the next conversation. We are not finished yet, because I would love to continue this conversation here in this room, but we're going to say goodbye to the online audience, but not before we also have a spoken word performance. So have a little break from the conversation and then continue later on. For now, I want to say goodbye to the online audience. Well, obviously, thank you already for joining this conversation. Thank you for watching. Next up, we'll be back the 14th of March with a second part of this series, Redesigning Journalism. And then we're going to talk about images, the use of images. If you want to know more about the fellowship of OneWorld, then you can listen to the podcast episode with John and Seada on redesigning journalism and gatekeeping. And if you want to support Bakhuis de Zwijger, you can always do that via dezwijger.nl, pay as you like. Thank you for now, and we will see you next time. And I would love to introduce Jonathan Chinfo. Please, Jonathan. Because you prepared a spoken word for us related to this topic. The floor is yours.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's crazy. It's like I predicted this live cast with the poem, what I wrote. What I have here in my hand is it's fabric, but in Surinamese culture, the stitching is called mamyo, and they are made of different fabrics from different cultures and of scraps that people normally wouldn't use, and then we make something new out of it. And that was where I got my inspiration from for this poem. Fai kantak minomoy. Fayu kantak minomoy. Fayu kantak minomoy. Natu bromchi mekimi. How can you call a language a mother when you are ripped from her touch, from her breast before tasting her sweet milk on your tongue? How can you call a language a mother when your father burned her history to the ground, erased her memory like she never existed? How can you call a language a mother when you have been taught the comfort of silence? Do not ask too many questions. How can you call a language a mother when you are shushed by even a whisper of her name? How can you call a language a home when your identity is broken down into a million pieces? You become the minority, paving your way uptown, forward, backwards, jumping to these never-ending labels: non-Western, migrant, expat, underdeveloped, colored, Black, Asian, LGBTQI. I do not understand. I do not want to understand. How can you call a language a home? By repeating inclusion, inclusion, inclusion until it loses its meaning. How do you call a language a home when you are always the other in a checklist of binaries? How can we create a language that heals? A language not afraid to embrace wounds of the past, not based on judgment, fear. A language that reaches out a hand. I want to understand. A language that leaves space to grow, knows it's okay to make mistakes, sees beauty in diversity, this spectrum of intersectional identities. I long for a language that connects, stitching all these stories into a never-ending tapestry. How do we create a language, a story, a poem that heals, that goes beyond caged birds singing, having a dream, climbing these never-ending hills? I long for a language that feels like coming home, a language sweet, soft, nurturing like a mother, bold enough to scream, I am here, see me as I am, I will never disappear. Thank you.
Wow.
Wow. Are you sure you weren't writing while listening?